there's light at the end of the tunnel. And you're right. Like there's so much to grieve when it comes to a divorce. A divorce really is like a death. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's even harder than a death because you have to grieve the loss of someone who's technically still accessible to
Right.
you. And that's complicated.
Yeah.
And so you're grieving not only the loss of your partner, you're grieving the future you were planning on. You're
Right.
grieving the life you thought you were going to have. You may have to grieve your house if you had to move, where you made memories. You might be grieving time with your children if now you have to share
Mm-hmm.
custody. So there's a lot that you are grieving. And so that in and of itself is a process that does take time. You've got to, be patient with yourself. But, connecting with other women so that you can talk about it and hear their stories, the women who are kind of further along, it definitely gives you hope.
Hello and welcome to the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. We're here to help you navigate life while disrupting the status quo. Our discussions cover a number of topics relevant to everyday life. We discuss everything from relationships to entrepreneurship. We also engage in some difficult but important conversations. And now, here are your hosts, Brian and Tanya Hamilton.
Welcome to another episode of the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. Today, we are joined by Leah Marie Mazur, and we'll be discussing divorce and just really recovering and building yourself up after a divorce. So, Leah Marie, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
No, we're excited to have you. And, let's start first by learning a bit about you. Who is Leah Marie?
So I'm a certified divorce recovery coach for women. I've been divorced twice myself, which was really, so after my second divorce, that was my big aha moment on having to figure my stuff out and obviously not repeat those patterns. And so essentially through my own recovery journey, I was able to create a framework for other women so that they don't have to go through the trial and error that I did, so that they can find their way, find themselves, rebuild their self-confidence, and heal after divorce.
Excellent. Well, unfortunately, experience is our best teacher sometimes. So
Yep.
let's start off by learning a little bit about your experience and how that helped you transition into what you do today.
Yeah. So I'll take you back a little bit. So when I was 16 years old, I witnessed my mom have an asthma attack in her home and die. And she was only 41 years old. So as you can imagine, that was really traumatic. And then 5 years later, my dad died of pancreatic cancer. He was only 46. So by 21 years old, my parents were gone. I'm an only child. And so what I didn't know at the time was that left me with really deep-seated abandonment issues. I had a fear of being alone. And so I coped with that by becoming almost a serial monogamous. So I just hopped from one relationship to the next for years, almost as like buoys to keep me afloat because I didn't know how to be alone. I was afraid of being alone. And so after my second divorce, that's when I realized, okay, Leah, like obviously you've got a pattern here. Something is going on. You can't keep this up. You can't keep doing this. And so I really had to just face my fear of being alone and figure out how to love myself, how to build my self-confidence back up, and how to create a life that felt good for me so that I could stand on my own 2 feet. And then through that, that's when I really found myself. I started really getting into meditation to help cultivate like self-awareness, because that's key, right? Like you can't make changes if you don't realize what you're doing to begin with. And so all of that kind of led me to helping other women. I always knew, I wanted to do something that was bigger than myself and help people. And so it kind of took my own struggles and obstacles to kind of figure my own stuff out and then go, oh, well, there's thousands of women literally struggling with this exact same thing. So now I can give them the tools and the guidance so that they don't have to kind of make the same mistakes that I did.
Excellent. Now, just for context, what was the time frame between the first marriage and the second divorce?
So I was married for about 5 years the first time. And then when that marriage ended, I did all the things you shouldn't do. And I hopped right into another relationship. And then when that relationship didn't work out, I was right back on the dating apps because that was my pattern. And I married the first person I went on a date with. And so I think that was, about 3 years apart, technically. I think from the time my divorce was finalized into the time I started that new relationship that I ended up getting married, I believe it was about a 3-year period. But I was dating somebody, even in the middle of that, because that's all I knew how to do.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, right? Because I'm sure as, you grew and you were, through those adult years, did you have anybody? Because, sometimes it's mom and dad who would be like, okay, Leah, Marie,
Right.
like, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
Did you have somebody that
Not
was able to
really.
ask those tough questions? Yeah.
No, and I think that was part of my struggle was like I've literally, I mean, since I was 21, I've just kind of been figuring everything out the hard
Mm-hmm.
way. I did have like a couple, like my cousin was like, "Are you sure you want to move in this fast? Like, are you sure you?" But I just wasn't in the space to receive that.
Yeah.
It was like I had already made up my mind. I wasn't open to like that kind of feedback anyway. I was just going to do what I wanted to do. But yeah, I mean, I didn't really have, like the parental figure or like people kind of um, taking me in and being like, listen, girl, you got to get your stuff together. Like, this isn't going to work.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, hey, even when you do have that sometimes, like you said, right? Like if you're not in that space to receive, the information or the knowledge that people want to impart, then you're not going to receive it either way. But
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Now, I guess, are there any common ties that you see when you're speaking with women? I guess that you could share that. Again, there's so many women who are in a similar place. When you have 7 billion people in the world, there's going to be people who have a lot of shared experience. What are some of the things that you can share that you see as kind of those commonalities between women who are recovering from a divorce?
Yeah. So self-esteem always takes a hit. I mean, 100% of the time when someone's coming out of a divorce, even if it was their choice to leave the marriage, they really struggle with self-confidence and self-esteem. It's a lot of that negative self-talk, that guilt, especially for moms. I see that mom guilt a lot. Like, did I ruin my kids' lives? Did I make the wrong choice? They broke up our family and our home. And so that I would say is like the number one thing is just kind of feeling, not great about yourself and feeling like broken or alone. Divorce is very isolating. And it's rare that when you're going through something like that, you have someone that's close to you in your life who's also going through it at the same time, so it's kind of like something you really are going through alone. And so that isolation can be depressing and make it, scary and complicated. And so I think that's kind of the most common thing that I see.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, right? It's everybody's situation is so different. So, you think of being pregnant. Usually there are people who are pregnant around the same time as you, but the end result is that there's a baby. Where with divorce, like everybody's situation is so different, whether they were the ones who, initiated it, whether they didn't want it, the reasons around the divorce. So even if you know somebody who's going through it, I'm going to guess that it can also be tricky, right? Because you might have one
Totally.
who's like, this is the best thing ever. And then the next person is really genuinely grieving the end of their marriage, right?
Totally. Everything's different. How long you were together, how old you were when you were married or getting your divorce, if you have kids, if you don't, if it was amicable, if it's not. So there's a lot of different things that can come up. And so one thing I always tell my clients is like, be careful of whose advice you're taking. Like, don't necessarily take advice from friends and family too, because even with the best intentions, even if, your family and your friends, they love you, they want the best for you, their advice isn't always practical. So like, for example, like I've had clients who are like, my friends just like, they're already creating this dating app for me and they want me to hurry up and get back on the horse and like fight. And it's like, that's coming from a place of love, but that might not be the most practical next step. Maybe you need to take some time for yourself, work things out, heal, figure out who you are, figure out what you want, right? So be really careful whose advice, you're taking. And that's why working with someone like me, like a coach or a therapist, depending on what you need, is great support and guidance because it's objective. Like we don't have that emotional investment, right? We can objectively kind of view the situation and give you tactical advice and actionable steps.
Mm-hmm. And I was talking to a friend the other day who's divorced. She said her counselor, when it just happened, had said, like, you almost have to give yourself, okay, I might get this wrong, but a year for every 5 years married, like to really grieve that and, work through that. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. So everyone loves to try to have a formula, right? Because that would make things so much easier. If they're like, yeah, this plus this equals this. But it doesn't always work out that way. I mean, it's okay to have kind of a general idea, but kind of going back to like what you said, everyone's so different. Like some people are like throwing divorce parties and like throwing their rings off a cliff the day that, as soon as that ink is signed on the papers, because they're like ready to go.
Right.
And then some people do, like if they have a hard time, if they're struggling with letting go or releasing like anger and resentment or guilt, and it takes them a little longer to process that. I see, especially if they're the ones that like had been betrayed, or they're the ones that kind of
Right.
had the rug kind of pulled out from under them and didn't even see it coming, and their whole life was turned upside down. Some of that could be a lot harder to accept. So it just really depends on where you're at and what the situation is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for yourself specifically, one of the things that you mentioned was that you really just didn't want to be alone. For anyone who, I guess, has that same shared experience, what would you recommend for them to, just as a starting point, to kind of overcome that?
Totally. There's a few things. So the first thing I always suggest is make sure you're nurturing relationships you already have. Because even if you're not in a romantic relationship, you're definitely not just like walking around on this planet all by yourself, right? You have people. Nurture those relationships, friends, family, coworkers. And then the second thing I love is getting a creative outlet. This is something that you really shouldn't underestimate, because it does a few things. Number one, it's therapeutic. Number two, it helps you pass the time. And then number three, it helps you figure out who you are. Like, who are you? What do you like? What brings you joy? What excites you? And when you find creative outlets, they also build your self-confidence, because you're doing something and then you get better and better at it, right? So it can do all kinds of things. And that can be anything. And that's really the time for you to explore and experiment and discover, like, what kinds of things have you always wanted to do, but maybe you just didn't have the time for, or you were afraid of what other people would think. Maybe it's taking that photography class, or joining that hiking group, or knitting. This is the time to play around and step outside of your comfort zone, so that you can find things that bring you joy and fulfillment. For me, I had always loved to sing. So as my second marriage was crumbling, I was like, you know what? I'm going to join a band. I'm just going to join a band. And so I did. And I joined this like classic rock cover band, and I started singing, and it built my confidence like no other. And it gave me that sense of fulfillment, right? Like, I was learning parts of myself. I was honoring those parts of myself that I knew were there, but I just didn't really give that much attention to. And it became a really fun part of my life that helped me feel more fulfilled. And when you do things like that, it allows you to be alone without feeling lonely, because that's kind of part of the thing, right? People think, well, I'm going to be alone forever, or being alone means I'm lonely. But those don't necessarily have to be the case. You can be alone and still live an amazing, fulfilling life.
Mm-hmm. And I used to work with domestic violence, men and women, and when those relationships would end, there's also there's so many emotions that come with that, but you're also left trying to figure out who you are. Mm-hmm. Right? Because totally. So many things, because of maybe the power, control, all that kind of stuff, you had to give up. So I guess when you're working with somebody like that, like, how do you suggest finding yourself again? I would just love to hear your thoughts.
Well, through creative outlets and things like that is great, because you're learning about what you're capable of, and you're learning about what you like and what you don't like, and what you're good at. So that's great. But journaling is a really powerful tool as well, because it helps you process your thoughts and feelings. It helps you give yourself answers to questions that you didn't even know that you had. It helps you track your progress. It's a really, really good tool. And so keeping track of yourself, like keeping track of how you feel or your perspective on things, and like writing it down and getting it out so you can work through it. And kind of like I touched on before too, just creating that self-awareness. And so for me, like, that was meditation. And I know that that's not everyone's cup of tea. But it is a really, really great exercise to do, to help you just tune back into yourself. Because what happens a lot of times is we get caught up in that like thought coaster. And it's like we're either ruminating about the past, which makes us feel depressed, or we're anxious, we're worried about the future. And then that gives us anxiety. So when you do things that help bring you into the present moment, you're tuning back into yourself. You can kind of quiet that outside noise. You can tune back in with that inner compass, and then doing things that feel like they're in alignment for you, like what feels good for you, what feels right, what are you naturally drawn to. When you kind of practice all of those things, you end up just finding yourself and finding your way.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm actually just curious, are you still part of that cover band?
Yeah, so it's a different band, but I'm still doing it. Yeah, I've been in a few bands since then, but I still sing a couple times a month. It's so fun.
That's
Cool,
great.
Yeah.
Other thing I want to talk about too is you mentioned journaling, and this is one thing that comes up a lot in a lot of the conversations we have, especially when we're talking about self-improvement, self-help. What advice can you give to someone who has trouble with the whole journaling experience?
Yeah. So I would totally suggest journal prompts, because instead of you being like, what am I supposed to write? Like, what am I supposed to even say? There's thousands of journal prompts that you could find online. And you can just kind of go through and find which questions resonate with you. And sometimes just one question is so powerful, and you could gain a lot of insight just by kind of answering those simple questions. Like in my online course, I have a 30-day journal prompt and affirmation guide that's included in that, because, you're not alone. I mean, there are people who are like, yeah, I know I'm supposed to journal, but like, what am I supposed to, put in here? So I would totally suggest journal prompts, because that's a great way to kind of like spark up some ideas, or kind of get you more motivated to dive deep and answer those questions.
All right. And the other thing too, if I remember correctly, you have a daughter as well.
I do. Mm-hmm.
All right. So when you were kind of going on this journey the second time around, what were some of the things that you did, as a parent, just to really, again, help your daughter? Because I'm sure it was a big change for her as well, and adapting to everything.
Yeah. So with my first husband, when we got divorced, she was only like 1.5. So there really wasn't a whole lot I had to explain to her. She doesn't even remember us being together. With the second divorce, she was a little older. She was like 6, if I'm doing my math right. And so honestly, I just was very honest with her. And I didn't come at it in a way that it was this big, bad thing. I approached it in a way that was very matter of fact. Like, well, this is what we're going to do. We're going to move into our new place. You're going to get a new room. You get to stay at the same school, and you get to stay with your friends. And, he's going to live here, and we're going to move here. And, some questions arise, and I was just very honest about it. And I didn't come at it in a way where she felt like it was a very heavy thing, even though obviously it is a huge thing. I didn't want to put that pressure on her, right? Because there's nothing she could do about it. So I just kind of said, yeah, this is just what we're doing. And this is, and that's that. But it really depends on the age. I've got clients who have kids that are teenagers. And so obviously they process it in a very different way, and they're going to have their own questions. But one really good tool is they actually make books to help you explain divorce for your kids. So depending on how old your kids are, you can find books that you can read to them that explains in their language what's happening and what to expect. And a lot of moms have found those really helpful.
Excellent. Now, the other thing I wanted to kind of focus on as well is, and I'm just going to share it on the screen here, but it's your Facebook group as well.
Yeah.
So you have that Facebook group, Divorced and Empowered. Can you talk to us about that group and that community?
Yes. So I had joined divorce groups on Facebook myself. And one thing that I noticed was there's a lot of anger in there. There's a lot of people that need to vent. They got to get that stuff out. They're mad about their ex. And I get it. You need a place to be able to do that. And you need to be able to speak to other women who understand. So it was important for me to create a community that was just a little more uplifting, a positive place, a place where we motivate and inspire each other and empower each other. And I go in there and I give free workshops, and people share different, their stories, their success stories, and ask questions. So it's a beautiful group. It's a private Facebook community. It's women only who are going through or have been through a divorce. And you can join if you're listening. And it's just a really amazing group of women. You can meet friends in there. And it makes such a difference because, like I said before, divorce is so isolating. And when you join a group like that, you realize you're not alone. Sometimes your specific situation, you're like, man, I'm probably the only one that feels this way. You're not. You're totally not. There's other people who get it and they're going through the same thing. And when you kind of find that common ground with somebody, it just makes you feel a lot better.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, knowing that everybody's at a different stage and you can learn, right? Like,
totally.
There's like, I don't know what they would all be called, but definitely, that anger, like there's so many parts. And they say that when our marriage relationship ends, like you're grieving that loss, whether, it was good, bad, and everything in between. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, to hear people talk, being on the other side of it, right? Being able to potentially co-parent and have a custody order in place that works for everybody and just different things like that. I'm sure it's very helpful for women out there.
Yeah, it gives you hope. It gives you hope to hear other people who have kind of gone a little further along, and they're saying, "Oh yeah, I know, it gets better. There's light at the end of the tunnel." And you're right. Like there's so much to grieve when it comes to a divorce. A divorce really is like a death, and sometimes it's even harder than a death because you have to grieve the loss of someone who's technically still accessible to you, and that's complicated.
Yeah.
And so you're grieving not only the loss of your partner, you're grieving the future you were planning on. You're grieving the life you thought you were going to have. You may have to grieve your house if you had to move, where you made memories. You might be grieving time with your children if now you have to share custody. So there's a lot that you are grieving. And so that in and of itself is a process that does take time. You've got to, be patient with yourself. But, connecting with other women so that you can talk about it and hear their stories, the women who are kind of further along, it definitely gives you hope.
Right, so some of the I want to talk about some of the common obstacles that you see now. One obviously that we've discussed a bit is getting into a new relationship before you're ready.
Yeah.
What are some of the other common things that you see?
Being alone in general is tough for people. Also another common obstacle I see is women who were with someone who they hopped into a relationship really fast. And so like if, somebody left you or cheated on you and then went and seems to be going and living there happily ever after, and you're kind of left in the dust, that can be really tough to process. And so in like a situation like that, it really comes down to like acceptance, like figuring out how to gain acceptance, and not making what happened about you. I think that's the toughest part is if you were cheated on, if you were left for someone else, that is a reflection of of what's going on inside that person. That's a complete reflection of that. And it doesn't mean that you weren't enough. It doesn't mean you're not good enough, right? Or that you weren't a good spouse, or that you didn't do enough. So be really careful, again, going back to that inner voice, right? It's like what conversations are you having with you about what's going on? And those things change your perspective and help you gain acceptance. Another really good tool, to gain acceptance is really challenging yourself to find the silver linings, like find the benefits of your divorce, whether or not you were the one who left. Because what happens is when you focus on everything that you're losing, everything, that is happening that you don't want to be happening, it keeps you in that lack mindset, and it keeps you really not feeling great. So to shift that perspective and how you feel, focus on the benefits. Like, what do you have now that you didn't have before? What have you gained? What wisdom, what knowledge do you have now that you didn't have before that you can take with you? And it could even be really small. Like, well, now I get the whole bed to myself. Right? I don't have to like fight with somebody all the time or answer to anyone. I can come and go as I please. I can spend or save my money the way that I want to. Whatever those little silver linings are, really try to find those nuggets, because that shifts your perspective of the circumstance, and then it changes the way you feel about it.
The other thing, and I'm just asking more out of curiosity as well, with the ladies that you work with, do you find that the majority of them, or just kind of a percentage, I guess, if you could kind of nail it down, how many of them are the ones who initiate divorce versus have their partner initiate the divorce?
Well, statistically, they say about 70 to 80% of women, they're the one, like 70 to 80% of the time, the women are the ones that initiate the divorce. Of my clients, it's almost, I don't know, probably 50-50, so something like that. Because I definitely get both. But it's not easy, no matter what, whether you're the one who decided or not, there's a lot to unpack, right? There's a lot to work through. But statistically, women are more likely, and they say here's why. So nowadays, women are just more financially independent than previous decades. And so, if they get to a point where they're just not happy, it's just not working, they don't need to be in the relationship. Right. They can leave and stand on their own. Women are also just less likely to put up with consistent, unacceptable behavior. Nor should they. If you think about it, it wasn't that long ago, which is kind of crazy, that like women couldn't do anything unless they were married. We couldn't buy land. We couldn't get a credit card. We couldn't work or get a job. We needed to be married in order to like do anything. We didn't have rights, right? And so now, this day and age, when women are in a place where they can financially do it, they can do it on their own. They don't need somebody in order to get a job, buy a house, have a credit card, take out a loan. They're just less likely to stay in a relationship that's not healthy. They want to get out. And it seems that statistically speaking, men are more likely to stay even if the relationship isn't good, where women are just not. Like there's men who will just deal with it, or men who will go astray and just kind of find new relationships even while they're still married. And women are the ones that are like, they kind of get to that breaking point where they're like, when they're done, they're done. And then they, they go and they file the paperwork and then they're out of there. So that's kind of what I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's an interesting dynamic that you bring up, because I hadn't really considered that. And, I was aware of the statistic that 70 to 80% of women initiate divorce. I was just wondering if it was different because, the group of women that you specifically work with are, looking to make some changes. So I was wondering if that kind of impacted, and it seems like it skewed the numbers a little bit, at least. To some degree.
I mean, I've definitely had both. The most guilt definitely comes from the women who decide to leave. Like guilt, shame, feelings of failure, like all of those things are really common when they are the ones that decide to leave. Even if they know it's the best thing, it's really something that they struggle with a lot.
And the other piece too that was interesting is you mentioned that men are more willing to just kind of deal with it, which is, maybe a topic for another show. But again, just thinking of statistics, like 75% of suicides are men. And a lot of times it is over a lost relationship. So just another... I don't really know what that has to do with today's show and where where I'm going with that, but it's just something that came to mind while you were, while you mentioned that.
I mean, even in my experience, with my first husband, it wasn't a toxic relationship. He wasn't abusive. He was a good man. We just weren't compatible. We had definitely gotten married for the wrong reasons. We met when I met him when I was 19, like, what do we know? Like, what do we know really in our 20s about, anything? And so we didn't make a good team. It wasn't a good partnership. And so I decided to leave, and he would have stayed forever. I mean, even though the relationship really wasn't good, he would have just dealt with it. But because I did the hard thing and I left that relationship, he has since seen the value in that. He has moved on. He's met the love of his life. They've had a baby, and this was years ago, but they've since had a baby. And so like, he's happy we're not together now. Like he finally got to the point where he's like, oh yeah, this was good. Like this was a good thing, but sometimes they don't see it like that, Yeah. Yeah.
And I feel like I've read or heard from somebody that, like, for women, once they've disconnected emotionally in a relationship, it's really hard to switch that around.
It
Right?
is. Yeah, that's kind of what I mean is like when we're
Yeah.
done, right?
Yeah.
Because so, and here's another thing, statistically, um, generally speaking, men are not taught when they're young how to process or communicate their emotions.
Mhm.
Okay. So that leaves women taking on a lot of the emotional burden in a relationship. And sometimes not just for themselves, but like for the whole family. And that will take a toll on you. And so they get to a point where they're just like, I just can't do this anymore. I've been trying to communicate with you. You're just not meeting me on the level, or you're not willing to go to couples therapy, or you're not willing to take responsibility, for what you've got going on, because everyone's got some stuff, right? Like everyone's got stuff they got to work out. But if you're not going to hold yourself accountable and work through that, there's only so much you can do. If somebody's not willing to put in the effort, or you're just not compatible, there's only so far that will take you. And so once a woman really has like kind of checked out emotionally, it really is hard to go back, but it takes a lot for her to get there too. I mean, that's one
Right.
thing. On average, it takes 2 years for someone to pull the trigger on a divorce, like on average. So sometimes somebody's thinking about it even longer than that, but it takes about 2 years of considering a divorce before they get to the point where they're like, I need to get an attorney.
Mm-hmm. I was just about to say, so looking forward after, the work is done, well, not done, but you know what I mean? After,
Yeah.
a lady, after you've put in that work, and you realize, what, maybe I want to try it again. Was there that like special moment where you realize, what, I think I'm ready to put myself out there? How does that work?
I don't know if there was a moment, but I got to a place where I felt like I didn't need a relationship. I just
Okay.
wanted one, right? And
Right.
that's where you want to get. If you
Yeah.
feel like you need a relationship to fill some kind of a void in you, like you don't feel whole, happy, enough, fulfilled, that is not the place to be choosing the right
Mhm.
partner, because you're a lot more likely to settle or miss red flags or just choose the wrong person altogether. So when I got to a place where I just felt good on my own and I wasn't attached to any outcome, like I could just date, and if it worked, like great, bonus. But if
Right.
it didn't, like thank you, next. Like I'm fine. I don't need it to work, right? That was the best place for me to be in, and that was the first time ever that I was there. I mean, it took me years and 2 divorces to get to that point. But when I did, I met the love of my life. My soulmate happened to be husband number 3. I tell him all the time, "You're my favorite husband. You're my favorite one," because I was healthy. Like I did the work. I got to the point where I was confident. I knew who I was. I could set boundaries. I had strong standards. I knew my deal breakers. I knew what I was looking for. I knew what I needed, and I didn't need a relationship. It's just like the cherry on the sundae. It adds value to your life. And so when you're at that place, then that's like the ideal place to be in to find the right person for you.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great measuring tool, I guess, if you will. Looking at it like that, it's just something that is going to add value. And, I think too of women, especially like, in their 50s, we were talking to somebody and they were talking about like the gray divorce where it's around like that 50 to 60, right? So if you've been married all those years, you now find yourself single, your adults or your children are grown, and all that kind of stuff. When you really get in, because sometimes at that point, it's just like, oh, I do want to be with somebody because I've just always been with somebody, right?
Yeah.
So looking at it, with that lens of it, is this relationship going to add, that value, right? And not almost fill a void. I think that's great.
Yes. You want your relationship. You don't want to start a relationship that's fear-based, right? Like I'm afraid of being alone, or I'm afraid no one's going to want me. That's not the right mindset to be in. But no matter what age, I mean, I've had clients in their 50s and 60s who found love again after divorce, no matter what age, it's really about focusing on you, like reflecting on the past relationships, taking responsibility for the role that you played. And that's not the blame game, but I mean, everyone has a role. So what role did you play so that you can empower yourself and make better choices in the future, so that you're not kind of like Groundhog Day, getting that same result over and over, or getting yourself in those same relationships again and again. So reflect, journal, heal, give yourself the space to figure out who you are and what you like and what you want, and do those creative outlets and find fulfillment, nurture the relationships you have with other people. And when you do those things, everything really, falls into place.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, Leah Marie, one thing I always like to do is take the opportunity to use your hindsight as potentially someone else's foresight. So what I want to do is just give you the opportunity to kind of think back to when you were 21 years old and on your own. If you were able to have the conversation with Leah Marie, knowing what you know now, what would you say to her?
I would want her to know that a relationship does not equal happiness or fulfillment, and that it's important for her to just find herself and really do things that make her happy and not worry about what other people think. And I think, the relationship is the biggest thing for me. It would be, a relationship isn't everything. And that doesn't mean it's not, puppies and rainbows. I think just having your own relationship with yourself is number one. And then everything else really does fall into place after that.
Excellent. Okay, so I'll ask you to finish the sentence for me. Relationships are
like a cherry on a sundae.
I like it.
All right. And, true or false? Happiness is a choice.
True.
All right. Awesome.
Yeah.
You passed.
All right. As we're wrapping things up here, I just want to make sure that we let everyone know where they can connect with you. So first, I'll mention your website. It's mindfullyready.com. Also, at Mindfully Ready is where we can find you on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. What are some of the things that we should expect from you moving forward, and things that we can just look forward to?
Yeah. So if you go to mindfullyready.com, I actually have a free empowerment guide and training video for women who are looking to gain acceptance, build self-esteem, and then gain clarity on what they want next. So you can grab that free guide that's available right now. And you can join Divorced and Empowered on Facebook to connect with other women going through divorce. And then I actually have an online course that I'm launching on Monday. It's got all the things in there that everyone's been asking me for. So if you're struggling to let go and gain acceptance, release guilt and shame and self-doubt, rebuild your self-confidence, release anger and resentment, set stronger boundaries, and rebuild your self-confidence, all of that's going to be in that online course that'll be available on Monday. And you'll find that on my website as well.
Great.
Awesome. So by the time this airs, that online course will be available. So make sure you check out mindfullyready.com. Leah Marie, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. For everyone who watched and listened, thank you for letting us disrupt your everyday.
Thanks for having me. I loved our chat.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. For more ways to listen, connect with us on social media. To be a guest or to partner with us, check out our link tree at Disrupt the Everyday. Join us next time for more ways to disrupt the everyday.